And from the Gospel of John, the very ending, Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe." Now, Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, technically, there is a 21st chapter in the Gospel of John, but it's believed by most scholars to be an appendix written by a different hand. So the original author of 1 through 20 wanted it to end here. Now, if we remember the beginning of John's Gospel, it goes all the way back to the very beginning of scriptural literature. In the beginning, hearkening back to that very first love song, this cosmic love story of God and creation and humanity. And then we get to the end and it just kind of leaves the story dangling and unfinished. Perhaps the author of the appendix was unsatisfied with this. But I want to go back to the beginning of the story. The very beginning, those first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, known as the Pentateuch, which tell the history of the people of Israel right up to the cusp of crossing over into the Promised Land. And one of the primary tasks of the Pentateuch is to answer the question, who is your God? And the importance of this question takes on new meaning as we begin to understand and recognize the many gods and many myths prominent in the ancient Middle East. And the main crisis of this portion of Scripture is the misidentifying of God. Well, maybe I can be like God, or maybe this statue over here is God. So now when they finally do inherit the Promised Land, then the primary focus shifts not from the people of Israel, but the history of the kingdom of Israel. And the prophets and psalms and wisdom literature look at the answer provided to the question, who is God? And then ask the question, well then, how do we be God's people? And the main crisis in this portion has to do with the threats to that identity as the people of God that are posed when their temple is destroyed, when they lose their land, when their palace is brought to ruin. The destruction of Jerusalem is the primary crisis in the Old Testament, says Walter Brueggemann in a lecture that he gave a few years ago that I recently listened to and from which I'm going to do a good bit of teaching this morning. So, as he explains, Jerusalem housed the temple, which is where the elite priests lived. It housed the palace with the king and his entourage, and it was the center of learning where all the scribes operated. These are the really smart lawyers. So Brueggemann concludes, if you take the chief priests and the king and the smart lawyers, you've pretty much got the urban elite. And the way the economy worked in ancient Israel, right, is that Jerusalem is surrounded by peasant farmers who lived at a subsistence level, but the economy was organized so that all the money flowed to the place where the elites lived. And the elites lived with great surplus wealth that was taken from the peasant farmers who barely got by. So in Jerusalem were elites living with great surplus wealth and the subsistence farmers who were funding it. It was a system of great economic injustice. And the prophets of the 8th century and the 7th century continued to say that this Jerusalem economic arrangement could not be sustained. Right? The prophets foretell of the coming destruction of Jerusalem within the framework of the will of God, which is to say, well, why would God allow Jerusalem to be destroyed? And the answer is, well, God's upset. So that begs the follow-up question, well, what is it that God finds so upsetting? Injustice. Right? We hear this from the prophet Micah, who directly answers the question, what does the Lord require of you? What is objective 1? To seek justice. In 1st Isaiah, we see prophetic warnings specifically targeting those who are in positions of power, capable of pronouncing decrees and writing laws, warning of impending doom if they do not establish justice for all of God's people. Isaiah 10, 1 through 3, doom to those who pronounce wicked decrees and keep writing harmful laws to deprive the needy of their rights and rob the poor among my people of justice, to make widows their loot, to steal from orphans. What will you do on the day of punishment when disaster comes from far away? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you stash your wealth? Well, things didn't change, and sure enough, Jerusalem was destroyed from far away by the Babylonian Empire. And then Babylon deported the elite leadership class. Explains Brueggemann, right? They did not deport everyone, but just the elites, because if you want to take away the energy for resistance of a people, you take away the elites. So the texts that I shared with you this morning are undoubtedly dated to the middle of the 6th century BCE, this time of diaspora, and they reflect the opinion and the faith and the crisis of the elite who were deported. Brueggemann reminds those of us who might not be up to snuff on our biblical history that this main deportation occurred in 587 BCE, but that by about 540, 50 years later, the geopolitics in the area began to indicate that Babylon would soon collapse in the face of Persia. And while they didn't know exactly what to expect, the main hope of these deported Jews is that the Persian government would permit them to go back home to Jerusalem. They longed for Jerusalem. Now, the middle chapters of Isaiah are known as 2nd Isaiah because they were written later than the first chapters. So the criticism of the ruling elite in Isaiah 10 is probably a different author than the passage from Isaiah 43, which represents the words of a prophet speaking specifically to these elite Jews who had been deported to Babylon and were longing to return to Jerusalem. We're most familiar with this portion of Isaiah because it contains the texts from which most of Handel's Messiah was written, and I'll get back to talking about Messiah expectations in just a moment. But Isaiah is speaking to these lamenting Jews, and he tells them that God, their Redeemer, will transfer their lament to Babylon. That is, Babylon will be destroyed, and a way will be made in the wilderness for those who have been exiled to return home. Now, initially, in verses 16 and 17, Isaiah hearkens to the ancient Exodus of Israelites from Egypt. He says, the same God who brought you out of Egypt is speaking to you now, says the prophet, the God who made a way through the waters and who extinguished the Pharaoh's soldiers like a wick. But then the prophet does something interesting. After poetically recounting the Exodus, he says, but don't remember these things. Wait, what? Why? Because, says God, I'm doing a new thing. And if you spend all your time looking back and remembering, you're going to miss what's ahead. Now that brings us to Psalm 137, which, says Brueggemann, is the only psalm that we're able to confidently date because it speaks directly to the context in which it is written, the lamentation of the exiles in Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and we wept. Now, the other thing that makes this psalm notorious, says Brueggemann, is that it ends in violence. The gleeful smashing of the enemy's children against rocks. These are some of the most embarrassing words in the Old Testament, remarks Brueggemann. How do we get to this, the people of God? Well, let's go back to weeping by the waters of Babylon for a second. The elites are weeping. You can follow along in the text if you want. The elites are weeping because they remembered the way things used to be in Jerusalem. All the while, their captors, the Babylonians, were asking them to sing the songs of Zion, likely a reference to a selection of songs from the book of Psalms that celebrate Jerusalem. The most well-known of these being Psalm 46, perhaps. God is our refuge and strength, our very present help in time of trouble. Hey, sing that song. Sing that song about how your home is a refuge and strength, and the one that we destroyed. Yeah, sing that song about that Jerusalem. Right? The Babylonians are taunting them. How can we sing such songs in a foreign land? The captives reply. And then they make this oath. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. Let my right hand wither. If I do not set you as my highest joy, O Jerusalem. Right? In other words, I am never going to forget Jerusalem. Now, what you have to notice, Brueggemann implores, is that the people singing this were the privileged elites who remember a Jerusalem that didn't exist. They over-remember the good old days. We know from the prophets that Jerusalem was a place of injustice and exploitation and greed. But they don't remember any of that. What they remember is their privilege and their wealth and how well off they were back in Jerusalem. But they don't remember the wicked decrees and the harmful laws by which their privilege had been preserved. So Psalm 137 is them saying, we will selectively remember the good old days, and we will resent forever that it's been taken from us. This is a psalm of nostalgia and over-remembering, claims Brueggemann. And if you put this text back to back with Isaiah 43, the message becomes, if you engage in too much nostalgia, you will not be able to notice what God is doing now on your behalf. And if you over-remember the way it used to be, you'll probably want to commit violence against people who have taken that away from you. So they hated the Babylonians because they lost their privilege and entitlement and their surplus wealth. They didn't entertain the thought that they lost it because of injustice. No, they lost it because of the Babylonians, and therefore I hope they all die. People who have nostalgia and over-remember the good old days are going to be inclined toward violence towards those who they perceive are taking it from them. And our preoccupation with recovering the way it used to be causes us to not notice the new things that God is working among us. So what does any of this have to do with Easter? Well, long story short, Persia did overthrow Babylon, and Cyrus allows the elites to return to Jerusalem. The temple is rebuilt, and the system of elites is kind of reestablished, except that by the time that Jesus was there was not a king, but they were kind of conscripted into the Roman Empire. Now, many Jews saw this as an affront to the prophecies which foretold of a Messiah who would reestablish the kingdom of Israel. Right? The Jerusalem elite knew of these prophecies, but in the meantime, they were kind of in cahoots with the Roman Empire, who allowed the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes to keep their positions of power and wealth in exchange that the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes promoted religious observance that didn't threaten the power of Rome or the lordship of the emperor. Right? Their assumption was being that those who have been taught that obedience is the highest form of piety are going to be easy to manipulate and control. Now, if you want proof of the cahoots, just notice to whom the Jerusalem elite turn when Jesus shows up and makes a scene in their temple courtyard. They went to the Romans. And then how did they convince the Romans that it was worth their time and effort to get involved with this Jesus guy? They told them that he claimed to be a king who was preaching about a new kingdom. And the people are saying that he is Lord, not the emperor. So on Palm Sunday, we see Jesus arriving to shouts of Hosanna, God save us. But he had prior been out wandering the periphery, speaking to the subsistence farmers, the artisans, dining with sinners, drinking with Samaritan women, teaching and preaching as he went. In other words, he had been proclaiming good news to the poor. But the elites say he's out campaigning. He's trying to win people over to his side so that he can overthrow the empire and become a mighty and powerful king. Never mind that when Pilate asks him, he says, well, yeah, my kingdom is kind of different in every way. It's not what you would expect. If it were, then my followers would be using violence to protect me, but violence doesn't have any power in the kingdom that I'm trying to build. Nevertheless, he is ultimately sentenced to death. And the charges brought against him by the Jerusalem elites were that he had claimed to be king. Now, they were being a bit duplicitous because all the while they were relying on the Roman Empire to provide the legal structure under which Jesus was charged, persecuted, and sentenced to death, they were provoking the Jews by enticing them to nostalgically remember texts about a Messiah who would lead them to victory over their enemies. That is, while they were relying on Rome to persecute Jesus, they were simultaneously using Jewish animosity towards Rome to rile the people up against Jesus. He hasn't come to save you. He's putting our way of life at risk. He's undermining our traditional values. And even those who are most oppressed by the powers that be can be taught to over-remember the past such that they place their hope in preserving the very systems and structures by which they are oppressed. And that is precisely what we saw happening as the crowd shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" This is a nostalgic over-remembering of the good old days, demanding violence toward the one that they had been told was threatening their way of life. The people had been riled up to demand and expect a king and vindicator who would lead Israel to victory over her enemies. Swords into plowshares? Spears into pruning hooks? I don't remember that part. Crucify! Crucify! Now, it's the crucifixion in which we see death used as a weapon against Jesus, who had been painted as the enemy. Right? In the crucifixion, we see a fulfillment of Psalm 137. Blessed is the one who kills his enemy. But in the resurrection, we see a fulfillment of a new set of beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who weep. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who demand justice. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Our eyes are opened to see violence for what it truly is. It's a tool for preserving injustice by keeping the oppressed afraid of what might happen if they ask for things to change. The resurrection says, do not be afraid. Demand change because we have victory over the real enemies of sin and death. Just as Jesus told his disciples. Now, you might not understand what I'm doing now, but soon you will. It's through the resurrection, through the lens of Easter, that things start to make more sense. We're able to see the truths of which the ways of sin and death have been so keen on keeping us afraid. That the poor really are the ones who are blessed, not the wealthy. That those who suffer really are blessed, not those who are super comfortable. That the humble ones really are blessed, not the people who are proud and boastful. Those who demand justice are really blessed, not those who pronounce wicked decrees and write harmful laws. And the peacemakers, they are really blessed, not those who depend on violence to maintain control of others. Now, on the night of his betrayal and arrest, Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And he told them, you don't realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand. And he gave them this new commandment to love one another. And then just moments later, he was arrested and had to rebuke Peter for drawing his sword against those who were bringing him in. Right? In a world where sin and death reign supreme, it doesn't make much sense to be loving. but in a world where Jesus is risen. In a world where the stone is rolled away and the tomb is empty, in that world there is new hope. Some of you here today might not believe in Jesus. You might not believe in God. But I hope that you'll leave here this morning at least believing in the resurrection. That is, I hope you believe that love has the power to shape this world for the better. Don't you dare believe that sin and death have the final word. Each and every one of you are part of an ongoing love story. Love story with a dangling ending that depends on what you believe. And you might not know what you believe. And that's okay. Most days, neither do I. I just want you to know that you're always welcome here as we lovingly try to figure that out together. Amen.